Yeah, thanks so much for that very kind introduction, and thank you so much for coming out and for the Center and the Status of Women for supporting this. I'm very jealous that you guys get to hear the series of talks that I wish I was here for the others that this is a part of. And as Jenessa said, I do a lot of research in stereotype threat. In fact, I've mentioned to a couple people already today that the first time I was on the campus of UCLA was in, I think, approximately 1997 or 96, when I caravaned down with some other graduate students from Santa Barbara to hear Claude Steele give a talk to this department, and I was with a groupie of stereotype threat at the time, and that was before I think I'd ever collected any data on the phenomenon. So here it's sort of really a privilege to be here this many, many years later, to be able to actually stand here and tell you about the research we've done on that foundational theory. Now, I probably don't need to have a slide, but we have to start somewhere, talking about the status of women in STEM, in science, technology, engineering, and math. And we do have to start by acknowledging that we have come a long way. It is the case that nearly 42% of science degrees are awarded to women these days, and in some areas of STEM, like the life sciences, over 60% of degrees are given to women. So there have been advances made. In 2009, 3 of the Nobel Prizes were awarded to female scientists. At the same time, there's still a ways to go. So in the more physical sciences, women are still vastly underrepresented. In computer science, only about 20% of undergraduate degrees are given to women. In engineering, less than 10% of engineers are women. And at the full professor level in science, it's still the case that only 10% of full professors are women. And these disparities, or the just mere underrepresentation of women in science, has led to sort of what we might call kind of ugly assertions, or things get ugly, I should say, when people then jump to the conclusion that maybe there are intrinsic differences in ability that could explain these differences. And while I think it's a reasonable question to ask if there are biological differences, from the perspective of a social psychologist, I was interested in Lawrence Summers' statement to this effect that he made in 2005, because to me, as a stereotype threat researcher, if I wanted to institute a international manipulation of stereotype threat, I would have the president of Harvard University make this kind of statement. So, you know, the question that we ask from the perspective of social psychology is, what effect does it have to merely know that people might be thinking of this? And that's where the theory of stereotype threat comes into play. When Claude Steele and Josh Aronson first proposed and did the foundational research on this idea, they suggested that merely knowing that these beliefs are out there and fearing that you could confirm them about yourself or about your group in your own eyes or the eyes of someone else could be enough to lead to underperformance on the kinds of gateway tasks, be they job interviews or standardized tests, that allow people entry into domains where they previously have been underrepresented. And of course, Jenessa has done really fabulous work looking at how the original concept of threat can be now understood as taking on one of many forms. Now, the work that I'll talk about today has been focused, as Jenessa alluded to, in trying to understand these mechanisms. Okay, we saw in the early days of the theory research showing the link between subtle reminders to being negatively stereotyped to showing underperformance, but what's going on inside of that black box to really account for these deficits? And that's the question that I really took on and wanted to pursue. So I'll be taking you through the kind of progress of the research we've done in that really over the past eight or 9 years. So I'll talk a little bit about explaining part of the process by talking about how threat maybe undermines attention regulation processes. I'll then sort of try to unpack that a little bit more. How exactly do situations of threat hijack attentional processes? And I'll present this integrated process model of stereotype threat that we've been working from and present some evidence in support of a couple of key pathways to that model. And then, you know, I think the benefit of taking what is a fairly micro-level approach of understanding the basic cognitive and affective mechanisms involved here is that can then inform where interventions are targeted to potentially reduce the effect and increase women's performance in domains that ultimately would affect their representation in STEM as well. So first, let's start with this first question of just trying to account for the process. So when I first became interested in this question, people had been trying to understand mediators of stereotype threat. Steve Spencer, who I know was here last week, had an early paper that tried to explore this and looked at things like evaluation apprehension and anxiety, concerns that would really speak to threat, showing that in fact people feel threatened in contexts where they think they're taking a diagnostic test, or they think they're the only woman in a group of men taking a math test. Our angle was to come at it from the other side. So what I was struck by when I first got interested in this topic was that even in the early days, there were a lot of research findings that people were coming up with, showing that these types of contextual cues or reminders of stereotypes impair math performance, and impair verbal performance, impair spatial abilities, impair memory, and even impair interactional types of things. If you think about some of the work that Phil Goff has done and Jennifer Shelton and Nicole Richardson have done, showing that whites might experience a variety of stereotype threat in interracial contexts where you fear that you could be labeled as being racist. So we were sort of thinking, well, these are really vastly different types of performance situations. So what is the core type of process that could be affected, that could account for performance across such a wide variety of different domains? And so our candidate variable that we started from was to highlight the role of working memory capacity. Now, working memory capacity is a cognitive construct, for those of you coming from outside of psychology, that can be sort of casually defined as your ability to focus attention on a task at hand while inhibiting other irrelevant information. This is a definition borrowed from Randy Engel. There's debate about exactly what working memory is, so this is the only definition. But it had been studied up until this time as an individual difference variable, or at least Engel and his colleagues had developed tasks to measure it as an individual difference variable. Some people are sort of better at mental focus than others. And so we started with a really simple question in our mind, which was just, is this something that can be pushed around situationally? So if we put people in a situation where we bring these stereotypes to mind, would we show temporary reductions in working memory capacity as a function of those situational cues that could then account for why women underperform on a math test, for example? So in the first couple of studies we did, they're really parallel studies, so I'll just talk about them in parallel. One with men and women, and one with whites and Latinos. We had them take a standard measure of working memory capacity called the operation span task. And these tasks are usually kind of dual processing tasks where people have to switch back and forth between one of two types of things. In the tasks we used in these two studies, they had to do a little bit of mental arithmetic, and then store a word away for later recall. Solve an equation, store a word. Solve an equation, store a word. And after, let's say, 5 of those, they would be cued to remember or recall all of the words from that set. So working memory capacity is really assessed as your ability to remember these words, given that you're having to kind of shift focus to some other attentional task that demands online processing. And we simply, in one condition that I'll label a control condition through all the kinds of studies I've talked about, we framed it in a very neutral way. We actually framed it as a working memory measure, because pilot testing showed that people didn't have ideas about gender differences in memory ability. And in the threat condition, we said that this is a measure that's correlated with quantitative performance, which it is in the literature, or that's correlated with performance on intelligence tests, which it is in the literature. And you see from the findings here that we only observe this kind of gender difference in working memory, a reduction of working memory capacity among women and Latinos in this condition where we brought negative stereotypes to mind for people. In a third study, we then replicated this the kind of common stereotype threat effect, where when women were told that they'd be taking a diagnostic math test, and I think we had a male experimenter in this study, they did perform worse on that paper and pencil math test. Just before they took the math test, we had them do a different kind of working memory measure that wasn't as obviously had anything to do with math. It didn't have math equations in it. And we replicated the same kind of an effect, where even in anticipation of knowing that you're going to have to take a difficult math test, impaired women's working memory capacity, in a way that statistically mediated the effect on later performance. So this was some of our first evidence of kind of a domain general cognitive impairment that might be happening under stereotype threat. In a more recent set of studies, we've been interested in one of the implications of this from a more general kind of attention regulation way, is that if people are impaired in working memory capacity in this sort of attentional regulation, then it might be more the case that you'll engage in mind wandering. So recently, Johnny Smallwood and Jonathan Schooler have done research looking at mind wandering. Some of their research sort of highlights the benefits of mind wandering. So if you're doing something sort of mindless, driving down the road, your mind might wander and it could be helpful for creativity. But mind wandering can also be seen as a byproduct of sort of deficits in attentional, in attentional focus, where attention becomes decoupled from the task that you should be doing. So in a couple of recent studies, we employed what's become kind of a standard mind wandering paradigm, where again with female undergraduates in the study, we put them in a situation where there are cues to stereotype threat present. So specifically, we told people we were interested in comparing men's and women's performance on a math test, and there was a male experimenter, versus a situation where there were no cues to threat obviously present. So we're looking at individual differences in problem solving with a female experimenter. And then we had people take what's called a sustained attention to response task. And it sort of is what it sounds like. It's a version of a go-no-go task, for those of you familiar with that, where in this particular task, there's just simple stimuli, like an O that appears on the screen. Your only task as a subject is to say, push a button if it's an O, and don't push a button if it's a Q. It's a sustained attention to respond task. It's pretty boring, it's pretty mindless. People go through many, many trials of this. But what previous research has shown is that when people mind wander, they make mistakes at the task, right? And what we found is evidence of this kind of mind wandering happening under stereotype threat. So women in the threat condition were more likely to make omissions, in other words, to fail to respond to the O, and the O is in fact there. They were also more likely to make errors, that is, inadvertently respond to a cue when they should have held off the button in that case. And the third kind of indicator of sort of failures of attention regulation in this kind of paradigm is that the response time variability was higher under threat. So people are just sort of losing focus of the task. They're responding when they shouldn't respond, they're not responding when they should respond, and in general their variability is a bit more all over the map. Evidence of a form of mind wandering. In a second study, we adopted another technique that has been used in mind wandering research, which is to have people take, we had people take a math test in this study, but we stopped them periodically. We warned them ahead of time that this would happen. We stopped them periodically and said, right now, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about the test that you should be taking, or did your thought just stray to something else? And they sort of rate this on a 5-point scale. And we replicate kind of a standard performance decrement when cues to stereotype threat are present compared to a no threat condition. But more importantly, what we find is that people are more likely to report having these off-task thoughts under stereotype threat compared to the control condition. Again, a finding that statistically mediates the effect on performance. So, across both of these first sort of two sets of studies, one that was some of our earlier work and some that's more recent, we see evidence of general kind of attentional difficulties under stereotype threat. People showing working memory deficits and sort of this evidence of mind wandering that together sort of jointly suggests that people are having difficulty regulating attention. But that doesn't really tell us all that much, except that there's something domain general about cognitive impairments taking place under threat. We were also then interested in trying to understand exactly how it is that cues in the environment are leading to these sort of attentional deficits in the first place. So we developed a theoretical model that really is just cobbling together a lot of findings that were out there and then adding some more of our own to sort of support an idea of there being multiple pathways by which these attentional processes could either be hijacked or otherwise impaired. So I'll walk you through the model and then I'll focus in on a couple parts of it and talk about some evidence for pieces here. But we have these environmental triggers of stereotype threat. Again, these can be realizing you're the only female student in your calculus class, or hearing something much more overt, let's say, or even just thinking that your math skills are going to be assessed or your science ability is going to be assessed. I've already shown you evidence about sort of decrements in working memory capacity. One pathway that we think could account for this is just a general physiological stress response. And other people in the literature have observed evidence of this kind of response. So for example, Mary Murphy and colleagues have shown that when women imagine themselves taking part in a science workshop that is mainly male participants, they exhibit a stronger physiological arousal response, stronger sympathetic nervous system activation, and as well as some avoidance and vigilance patterns as well. Other research has pointed to maybe an increased cortisol response under stereotype threat. And so there's some sort of suggestion that just that kind of physiological stress response that might take place in a lot of different kinds of situations where we expect to be negatively evaluated or if not criticized, could be directly impairing the kind of frontal processes needed for performance in these kinds of situations. But we think that at a more kind of cognitive, psychological level, that the other thing that could be taking place is that situations of stereotype threat put people in more of a situation of having to monitor their performance at a more conscious level. So I would argue that for most of us, we end up with some routines that we follow in our lives, right? Sometimes we bemoan the fact that our lives become routines. But the function of those routines is that we're able to perform our daily responsibilities and tasks and performance somewhat on autopilot. Even things that take some mental effort, we still kind of perform somewhat on autopilot. But we think that what stereotype threat partly does is switch people out of autopilot. That now, if there's this threat that you could confirm a stereotype about your group or about yourself, that now there's more of a conscious monitoring of, am I doing well, am I doing poorly, am I confirming the stereotype, am I not? And that conscious process of monitoring performance could be utilizing some of the same frontal resources that you would need for performance in the past. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Part of that monitoring process, we think, presumes appraisal processes. So you're vigilant to cues in the environment, you're also appraising what they mean, and those cues might be more likely to be appraised in a negative way, leading to negative cognitions like thoughts of self-doubt, feelings of anxiety, and some research has shown evidence of these kinds of negative emotions and cognitions in stereotype threat. At the same time, we tend to intuit that in high-stakes performance situations, whether or not it's taking the GRE or giving a job interview, that anxiety is not great for performance. So we also think that people are going to be expending some of their mental capacities, some of these frontal processes, actually regulating negative thoughts and emotions that could get in the way of performance. So we also have done some work that I'll tell you about in a second, looking at these kinds of suppression processes as partly being cognitively debilitating. So let me start by talking about this part of the model, talking about this idea of enhanced monitoring of performance. And we think that there's probably a few things at play here. We think that this enhanced kind of monitoring of performance is partly motivated by a sense of uncertainty that priming a self-relevant negative stereotype engages. So for example, we have some recent data that we're kind of working on where we're using a measure to tap into people's sort of working self-concept, the degree to which they associate themselves with the domain of math for women. And we're finding that under stereotype threat, that working self-concept, just as they're about to take what they think is a diagnostic math test, is unrelated to the self-concept we measure in a baseline task. Whereas for men, or for women not under threat, there's a nice, strong, positive correlation between the two. So we think people kind of aren't tapping into their default self in the domain when threat is activated, in part because that negative stereotype, in some sense, poses another question, poses another possibility, which is you don't fit here, you don't belong here, and you're not going to do well here. We think part of that too is that then people become, because of that negative stereotype, they become more vigilant to looking for negative cues in their environment. In a paper that I won't spend time talking about, we used an ERP paradigm to show that people show enhanced error-related negativity to errors that they make on a task under stereotype threat, particularly to the degree that they value doing well in that domain. So I think that's part of what's happening. But because that negative stereotype is activated, we think that those appraisal processes that are going on are also likely to be biased in the direction of more negative thinking. I alluded to earlier the idea that there's already research out there showing that stereotype threat seems to activate thoughts of self-doubt. We think that those thoughts of self-doubt then provide a lens that motivate other kind of bias processing. So let me tell you about a study that, the study I'm sort of alluding to here, that tries to demonstrate that kind of biased interpretation. This is actually part of a set of studies. This one was done with female college students. We brought them into the lab, manipulated stereotype threat in kind of a similar way that I've been talking about, telling people that we're looking at gender differences in a diagnostic math test, compared to a neutral condition where we tell people we're looking at individual differences in our problem-solving exercise. And it turns out that's enough, that if you actually give people a math test, that's enough. You know, even though it's very clearly math, like, that can be enough to sort of create these problems. We then gave people a self-report questionnaire, how anxious are you feeling, about this test that they think they're going to be taking, either the math test or that exercise. And I'll mention right off the bat, we didn't see main effects. Threat didn't necessarily lead people to report feeling more anxious, which is something we actually seldom find in our own research, that people actually report feeling more anxious. But I'll come back to that point later. So we're going to use this initial measure of anxiety actually more as an individual difference measure in the study that I'll talk about. Some people just, for whatever reason, report feeling more agitated and nervous than others. And then we gave people a working memory measure that we modified in an important way. This particular measure is a version of a reading span task, which is, again, is another one of these dual processing tasks where people go back and forth between having to read a sentence, store a word away for future recall. Read a sentence, store a word. What we did to sort of doctor the task is that some of the sentences were constructed by us to prime words of doubt, and some were constructed to prime words of confidence. What we wanted to do is to try to manipulate these thoughts of doubt orthogonally to the anxiety or arousal level that people might be experiencing. Because our hypothesis here is that those thoughts of doubt negatively skew what anxiety means in a threat situation. That if people are in this kind of monitoring mode under stereotype threat, that even your own arousal level takes on a different, more pernicious meaning. And we wanted to literally, well, figuratively, not literally, inject thoughts of doubt or confidence in people's minds, and this is the best. Contrary to what sci-fi movies might tell you, you can't really inject memories in people's heads. So we thought this was our best way of injecting doubt and confidence in a way that people didn't know what we were up to. I can actually show you a little bit. No, I can't. Well, maybe I can. I can't actually see what you see. Oh yeah, I can do this. Okay. I can show you a little bit what these tasks look like. So, like I said, they have a word that they're supposed to stick away for later recall, and then a sentence like this that they're actually supposed to read aloud. And it presumably gets recorded, so we know that they're doing it. And I've underlined these words just so you can see, but they weren't underlined for participants. So they just think that they're having to sort of do this concentration task where they're reading words and remembering words and so forth. And then, like I said, after a set of maybe 5 or 6 or 7, they're then cued. Remember all of the words that you could from that task, and you get variability. And that in this study is our measure of working memory capacity. All right, let's see if I can get out of this now. All right, so what did we find? Again, this is kind of a complicated design, but we have people under stereotype threat that we'll look at first. So these are all women who are expecting to take a difficult math test that we'd never actually give them. And then in the meantime, we measured their anxiety about this test they thought they were going to have to take, and then we primed them with these thoughts of doubt and confidence. So what's interesting here is that you might think that just the more anxious you are, the more kind of attentional problems you're going to have, the lower your working memory capacity. But we have no main effect of anxiety. We also don't have an inverted U. We have no kind of curvilinear effect either. We also don't have have main effect for doubt. So another hypothesis would be just thoughts of doubt generally lead to memory impairments here. Instead, what we have is this interesting interaction where if you said you were anxious about what was going to happen and then you were primed with thoughts of doubt, you showed lower working memory capacity. But if you were anxious and primed with thoughts of confidence, you actually show higher working memory capacity. So we think that in some sense, again, the arousal level you're experiencing ends up taking on a different meaning, a metacognitive meaning, depending on these other primed negative or positive thoughts. Now, like I said, since we know that usually situations of stereotype threat prime thoughts of doubt, this is probably the more typical pattern. So the other way to think about these results is that if you can prime people with thoughts of confidence, that's actually a way to turn things around, and you can turn them around quite dramatically. The other thing that I think is interesting about these data, and I should say that we have this kind of replicated in another study, is that we see this pattern in the situation that's sort of highly self-relevant for people. They think they're going to be taking a diagnostic math test. But in a control condition where the situation is much more neutral, it's just a problem-solving exercise, nothing about gender is mentioned, these same kinds of cues don't have the same meaning. They don't have the same impact that they have. And again, we sort of take as evidence that these situations sort of bring online this monitoring process and this biased interpretation process in a way that doesn't happen for all of us all the time. It only happens in these diagnostic situations. Now, we wanted to show, again, this is a self-report measure of anxiety. We wanted to show kind of a conceptual replication of this kind of idea with a more physiological measure of sympathetic activation. So the next study I'll tell you about, I'll talk about it before I put the slide up. We had participants come into the lab. These were all women who told us that they were going to be taking the GRE in the next couple of months. And so they signed up to come into our lab for 2 hours on a Saturday to take a practice test, both a verbal and a math test. And we did some other things with them. We also got saliva samples that we assayed for salivary alpha amylase. So this is a way to index catecholamines in the system, particularly sort of sympathetic nervous system activation, just as they're about to take the math portion of the test. So we have people with low salivary alpha amylase and high, so you can think about this as kind of high arousal versus low arousal. And then we have an individual difference measure of reappraisal tendencies, where high reappraisers are people who say, I generally try to take negative situations and think about them in a more positive way. People who tend to turn their negative affect into positive affect. Whereas low reappraisers, I guess, wallow in their negative affect. And we see the same kind of interaction pattern now predicting performance on this practice math test, where the people who say, you know what, I try to interpret negative emotion in a positive way, show this nice positive correlation between their sympathetic activation, their sympathetic arousal, and performance in the math test. And those who say, I don't try to do that, show the negative pattern, where the more sympathetic activation they have, the lower their performance. This is for the social psychologists in the crowd. This is very much a Schachter and Singery type of finding. So I'm big fans of Schachter and Singer. So that, with those couple of studies, a little bit of evidence for what might be going on in this part of the process. But like I said, we also think that in general, these situations tend to activate thoughts of doubt, tend to then, maybe lead to a more biased interpretation of anxiety or arousal. So then you have this negative affective experience, and what do you do with it? Well, again, we think people intuit that it's probably not very functional to be thinking this way, and that people under threat in particular might be motivated to, if not push those thoughts out of mind, at least to avoid revealing them to others. So we're going to talk a little bit about this part of the model, and particularly two kind of key hypotheses here that targets might try to avoid appearing anxious under stereotype threat, and to the degree that they engage in these kind of avoidance, anxiety avoidance tendencies, that would be cognitively depleting, that would impair working memory capacity. Now, the challenge with even addressing this question, I was talking to a few folks about this earlier, is that if you look at the emotion regulation literature, much of it is built around explicitly telling people to suppress an emotion or express it or reappraise it or et cetera. And we wanted to have a dependent variable to try to measure the degree to which people would engage in some kind of suppression process spontaneously or due to stereotype threat. So we had a sort of methodological quandary of how do you actually capture this as a dependent variable as opposed to manipulating it as an independent variable. So the solution we came up with, which is not perfect, but I hope it's somewhat cool, is to employ a version of a dot probe paradigm, which I'll go into a little bit of detail because it's a little complicated. But this was a study, again, this is actually part of a set of studies, but I'll talk about the one that we particularly focused on women. So this is a study with female participants, again, undergraduates, put them again in the same kind of stereotype threat versus control situation. We gave them a dot probe task. And like I said, I'll talk about that in a little more detail in a second. We actually used it in two ways. In half of our sample, we used it as a measure of anxiety, and in half of our sample, we used it as a measure of anxiety avoidance, and I'll tell you about that in a second. We then gave people a working memory capacity measure like the ones I've been talking about, and both of these, this we described to people as a filler task. So again, this is a paradigm where people think they're going to be taking a diagnostic math test as the central focus of the study. We sort of, we do a lot with them here, so we never actually make them take the math test, but that's our induction of stereotype threat. So just to sort of show you first, we replicate kind of our basic finding, this reduction of working memory capacity under threat compared to control. Now, let me talk a little bit about the dot probe task for those of you not familiar with it. This is a task, it's a reaction time measure, and it was originally developed by McLeod and colleagues as an implicit measure of anxiety. And the basic idea behind the task is that if you're feeling anxious, the way McLeod studied it, if you're a chronically anxious person, that your attention is going to be naturally drawn toward anxiety or threat-related stimuli. And so if that's the case, and you're doing a task like this one, where two words appear on the screen, you're supposed to be looking right here, and then you're supposed to say if the dot that appears on the following screen is above or below that central fixation point. So if your attention had been drawn toward the word anxious, you should be faster to say the dot is in that same location than if the dot had been in the other location. So this is, again, it's a different score, so you get these reaction time measures that tap into this kind of attention allocation, where positive numbers might normally be interpreted as faster reaction times to anxiety words that then can maybe interpreted that people are feeling anxious. So for half of our sample, when we gave them this task, we described it in a neutral way. We said this is just a measure of perceptual focus that we want to do before we get started. And in this way, we thought we could interpret people's scores in the way McLeod did as an implicit indicator of people's level of anxiety. So remember, like I said, we seldom find people self-reporting feeling more anxious under stereotype threat. That was true in this study as well. But what we did find here is that in that threat condition, people are expecting to take this diagnostic math test, that women showed this kind of attentional, their attention being drawn toward anxiety-related stimuli that they don't show in the control condition. Now, we had another half of the sample, because so far this leads us to some insight that people are in fact feeling anxious under stereotype threat, even if they either can't or won't admit it. But like I said, we also wanted to try to get a measure of anxiety avoidance, of wanting to not appear anxious. And so for the other half of our sample, we told people what the dot probe is. We said, hey, this is a task we're going to use to measure how anxious you are, and here's how it works. So we described it for people under the assumption that if they understood the task and they didn't want to appear anxious, that when that anxiety word would appear, they would try to redirect attention the other way. And so now we could interpret negative reaction time scores as a measure of anxiety avoidance instead of the other way. And so what we find in that half of the sample is that under threat, people show this more anxiety avoidance pattern, that they're looking away from those anxiety-related words, and we can kind of capture that with this measure. Now that maybe provides a little bit of insight that stereotype threat motivates this avoidance of this negative affective experience. But remember, we also have this hypothesis that this would relate to the cognitive deficits that we've been trying to unpack and understand. And they took that measure of working memory just after they did this dot probe task. So we were able to look at the correlations between their reaction times on this measure and their working memory capacity on the subsequent measure. And what we find is that in the threat condition over here, the more people are engaging in anxiety avoidance, the lower their working memory capacity. And here, the more people, when we use, here we're using the measure as a measure of anxiety, so the more anxious people are feeling, the lower their working memory capacity. So you might sort of build this picture that threat, anxiety, avoid anxiety, and the same people are doing both of those things, then they both end up being depleted. And these correlations are just non-significant in the control condition. Again, the idea that threat is really activating these processes that aren't normally being activated, at least not on average, for people in this paradigm. All right, so I've given you a lot of information about sort of these specific mechanisms we've been trying to understand. What I want to do in the third and the last part of the talk is then talk about how we use some of that information to try to understand ways to circumvent these processes, alleviate threat, and as a consequence, kind of boost women's performance in a way that equals men's. So one clear way, given what I've just been talking about, is that if people by default kind of intuit that anxiety is bad for performance, then a reappraisal manipulation should be a beneficial way to negate those effects. And I've already shown you data suggesting that people who dispositionally are reappraisers seem to show much improved performance under a situation that we might normally think of as being stereotype threatening. But this is a dispositional approach. We wanted to know, could we actually manipulate reappraisal in a way to show these same kind of effects? So we brought people into a lab, actually part of the same kind of .pro sets of studies I was just talking about, where in one condition we told people, yeah, people often think that anxiety is bad for performance, but you know what? Research shows that it can be benign. Sometimes it can even be helpful for performance, which isn't exactly a lie. It can sometimes be helpful for performance. We've already shown that. And it turns out that when you give people that reappraisal, and this is sort of combined with a no threat control condition, that they do perform better. These are women, again, female participants. They do perform better on a math test. They do show higher working memory scores, and again, that sort of mediates this effect. So reappraisal can be an effective manipulation that can be employed to boost performance in a directed way. It doesn't have to be an individual difference variable. We showed in another study, this was one with Latinos, that reappraisal works, and it also prevents that avoidance pattern that we documented using the dot code measure. We have a paper that came out last year where we did this kind of reappraisal manipulation in a sample of another sample of participants who were going on to take the actual GRE a couple of months later. So we actually tracked them and had them come back and tell us how they did. They actually brought their score sheet in, and we brought back their scores. And the reappraisal that they did in the lab actually improved their GRE math score down the road. I would say, though, that this actually was true for both men and women. So it didn't actually just benefit women in this study, it actually benefits everybody. So reappraisal's good. I'll tell some people. We were also interested, this is kind of an earlier question, but one that I think is an important one that speaks to the same idea of reappraising what anxiety means. A few years ago, we were interested in the idea that even, for those of you who are new to this theory, sitting in this room and learning about stereotype threat might actually offer a different appraisal of what anxiety means. Because now, if the default tendency is to think about your anxiety in a performance situation as evidence that things are going poorly, that if you understand stereotype threat theory, there's at least a more external way to frame it that could be beneficial for taking that pressure off the self. So in this experiment, we were kind of pitting these two ideas, and quite honestly, when we set out to do this study, we were worried about what could happen, because you could easily come up with this alternative hypothesis that knowing about the threat could just make stereotypes come to mind more easily the next time you go in and take a diagnostic test. But again, we thought that these kind of appraisal processes were an important part of it, and that stereotypes, at least if framed in this way, might offer this kind of external explanation that sort of reduces pressure off of the self. So in this study, we had male and female college students. These were all students who were actually taking statistics, like psychology statistics, so they were sort of very interested in their math performance at that time in their life. And they took a math test under one of three instructional conditions. In one condition, we said, this is just a problem-solving task. We just want to see how people solve these kinds of problems. And in that condition, women perform just as well as men. And I want to sort of say, just to sort of stop and highlight that these participants, actually, women did have lower GRE or SAT scores than men. So, I mean, this is sort of the standard kind of no threat or threat-free condition that maybe Steve talked about it as. And you see women sort of performing equally to men on the math test when the threat is sort of removed from the situation. In the second condition, we told people this is a diagnostic math test, and we're going to be comparing men to women. And again, that's where we see this sort of common decrement of performance for women compared to men. The third condition was identical to this one, where we said this is a diagnostic math test, we're going to be comparing men to women. But we went on to then say that the reason we're doing this is because we're studying this theory called stereotype threat. So as a social psychologist, this is about as honest as we can get. So we said this is what we're interested in. We defined what stereotype threat is, just the way we've been talking about it here. And we said, you know, it's important to keep in mind that if you're feeling anxious while taking this test, this anxiety can be the result of stereotypes that are widely known in society, and the anxiety could have nothing to do with your actual ability to perform well on the test. And in this condition, women perform just as well as men. And for those of you who know a little bit about the controversy about whether or not to adjust for SAT score, this results are identical regardless of whether or not you actually adjust for SAT score in these analyses. But these were how they were published, because this came out a little bit before that controversy. So again, some nice evidence, we thought, that knowledge is power, that knowing about these effects can actually be a way to kind of defeat them. Let's see, I'm eyeing the time. We have until, I'm trying to decide how much, we have until
about maybe 5 more minutes.
Okay, good, no, that's good. I wanted to tell you about one last set of studies, but I instead of talking about all of them, I'll probably just talk about the last one, so I might have to scroll through a few things. But one of the things that we've done more recently is we've been interested in kind of going back to the start of the question and saying, you know, these cues in the environment trigger something, you know, so being in a room of one woman surrounded by men, or knowing that you're taking a diagnostic test, triggers some kind of thoughts in people's heads. And I've sort of been of the mind that a lot of these processes happen kind of under the radar, that they probably happen fairly unconsciously without people having a whole lot of insight into what's going on. And so that got us interested, particularly a former student of mine, Chad Forbes, interested in the role of implicit associations and how implicit associations could be retrained in a way to reduce stereotype threat. So I won't go into, I'll talk a little bit about this slide, but then like I said, I'm going to scroll through a couple of studies to just get to the last one. But in general, we were interested in this study, in a set of studies, between the difference between retraining people's attitudes, I like math, and retraining the stereotype. Math is associated with women rather than men. We were of the mind that, I mean, the reason we were this is an interesting question is because when you look at some of the existing research that's out there on implicit associations related to math and gender and so forth, women both have a more negative implicit association to math, although men's isn't crazy positive either. And women and men too are more likely to associate math with male. So either of them seem like candidate places to start, right? Do we get women to like the domain, or do we sort of change the stereotype? Well, we came from a theoretical perspective, sort of heavily drawn from some work that David Amodio had done, that attitudes are really these valence structures, and that they're going to have more to do with motivation. If I like something, I'll approach it. But that doesn't mean I'm going to do well at it, right? So we think that really you have to retrain the stereotype if you're going to deal with the kinds of attentional processes and everything that all the kinds of mechanisms that we think get triggered by these cues to threat. So, like I said, well, let me talk a little bit about this. The studies that we have done to look at this all follow a common paradigm where we bring people in on day one and they spend a good portion of time doing this retraining paradigm. When we're retraining people's attitudes, the paradigm is to basically do an adulterated version of an IAT. If any of you know some of the work that Mike Olson or Kara Kawakami does, it's sort of drawn on some of their ideas. So I'll show you what it looks like for the life because I thought I was going to talk about that study. Where people are doing this kind of simple categorization, but they're having to deal with two different categorizations simultaneously. So some of the, one of the lists that they're categorizing are things that are idiosyncratic things people could like or not like coffee, right? I like coffee, okay, I don't like garlic, okay. And then some of the words that they're given are words that pertain to the second categorization on the screen, math or language. So equations goes in the math category, obviously. Writing goes in the language category. The idea, you know, they think this is a categorization task, but the idea is after you do many, 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 many trials of this, that essentially we're remapping an association between math and liking, or language and don't liking, I should say and, not or, language and don't liking. And then so for half of the people, it's switched the other way. Now, we also did this with a stereotype version where people are being retrained with men are good at language, women are good at math, over and over and over again to kind of rework that association in people's head so that at the end of day one, they've just, unbeknownst to them, and our debriefing suggests that people do not pick up on this, unbeknownst to them, what they've just done is grouped together things women are good at with math over and over and over again. So our question was, having done that on day one, does that then benefit them coming back on day two? So like I said, let me scroll through these studies, save them for Q&A. And I'm just going to talk about the effects on stereotype, the stereotype retraining. So when, and these are all women in this study, so when women were retrained on day one to associate women, math, women, math, women, math, women, math, and they come back to the lab and take both a working memory measure and an actual math test under stereotype threat or neutral situations, what we find is that being retrained with the counter-stereotype, women are good at math, both boosts working memory capacity and boosts their math performance. So actually reworking those associations can directly kind of defeat those kinds of processes, especially in a stereotype threat context. You notice that it doesn't happen in the neutral context. It's really something that benefits people under stereotype threat. And just the caveat to all of that is that the attitude retraining doesn't show that same effect. The attitude training will make people work on math questions, but it doesn't affect them. It doesn't allow them to perform better on them, is the bottom line. So to summarize, the whole, the main kind of takeaway point from all this research on stereotype threat, for those of you who are new to it, is that women's underperformance in math and science and technology can in some ways be created by these subtle reminders of being stigmatized in the first place. And we see these cognitive deficits that, that can impair the kinds of performance that we all rely on to excel in what we do in our careers. These performance impairments from what we've shown seem to result from some attentional impairments. And those attentional impairments might be partly a function of this kind of metacognitive monitoring process that we've looked at, as well as more suppression processes that might hijack or work against the working memory resources that people need. And these attention deficits can be reduced through both reappraising what anxiety means as well as retraining the stereotypes that people have. So let's see, with that, I'm going to skip through some other things so that I can get to my thank you slide. So thank you so much for your attention.